Hello, and welcome to episode 83 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is Jon in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
My man, another test, another review. You ready for it?
I'm always ready for it, John. I'm excited about this one.
Me too. There's a lot of interesting things that happen, as we will get into. And it's been a good week in general, as you know. Probably my favorite sports week of the year.
Not mine, but I know why it's your favorite, and that is because, as an Augusta native, you love the Masters.
Yeah, as we'll get to, it was tempered a little bit by what should have been your favorite sports moment of the year, when you won the stupid NCAA pool, and I came in 1 point behind you in second. That's not the last time you'll hear me complain about that today, probably.
But you meant glorious, not stupid.
Well, I'm still a little bitter. But yeah, the Masters is always fun. I love that tournament. So, in honor of it, I think we have both made a Masters-themed cocktail.
We have. We're going to have an azalea, which is, as they say, the unofficial cocktail of the Masters. But I don't know. You and I both lived in Augusta. That's where we met. I'm not sure we would call it that. But nonetheless.
Yeah, I've never had one, which I think kills its credibility at least a little. It's the official flower of the Masters. It's what it's named after. Is that like blooming shrub that always appears in April?
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, well, this is a drink that, depending on how you make it, typically is made with 2 ounces of vodka, a couple ounces of pineapple juice if you have it on hand, 1 ounce of lemon juice, not lemonade, but lemon juice. It was the specification in this particular recipe, and then grenadine to color it. So you get a largely red, pink, yellow kind of concoction, and then it all blends together and has that kind of like deep ruby color to it.
Yeah, the azalea color. I went with vodka. I think you can also go with gin on this. Sounds like you're a vodka man today, too.
I'm always a vodka guy. I've only had a few gins that I like. I think we've talked about that before, where I like the Botanist gin, but it's still gin to me. I don't really like the flavor of it that much. So vodka always. Rum number 1, vodka number 2 in my heart.
There you go. There's nothing wrong with that list. Your wife and children 3 and 4.
This is the alcohol list, man.
Oh, I see.
Actually, this was just the straight hard liquor list, because of the wine list is a totally different one.
Yeah. Speaking of golf, and this is the last time I'll bring it up because there's other things to talk about, but it's also one of our favorite golf tournaments coming up this week, too. Our beloved Heritage in Hilton Head Island.
Yes. This is actually my favorite golf tournament. Yours being the Masters, but mostly because I find the Heritage was always the best party week of the year when I lived in Hilton Head. And you and I both have had a number of interesting times during that tournament, most of which cannot be discussed on a family level podcast like this. Maybe some other day we can go into that. But a lot of boat parties, a lot of late nights, a lot of like hanging out with pro golfers at times.
Yeah.
I remember getting just completely slammed with Darren Clark years ago.
He's fun.
Yeah,
I had a shot off with, who was it, Ian Poulter, I think, in a clubhouse one day. And I'm not even embarrassed to admit that he beat me.
He should.
Wow,
That's the great thing about something like the Heritage. You live on an island like Hilton Head, and it's already a tourist location, but once you are a local, you get so many benefits. I remember having tartan club passes into the clubhouse, which gives you full access to everything, open bar, free food, stuff like that. People just be handing out. And I will admit, I'd miss those days.
Those are fun. I can tell you, too, in talking to some of those golfers, it's usually their favorite week of the year, too. They love that tournament. Let their hair down a bit. Beautiful
course, beautiful location. Hilton Head in general is a really cool place. A little small for me, but still very, very cool overall.
For sure.
Enjoyed my time there. And I know you did too.
I think it might have been a bit one-sided, the enjoyment. And nobody was sad to see me go, but it was fun. Speaking of parties and party anthems, pour one out for the artist of the day. We've got a song here by DMX. I didn't even realize the name of the song was this much, but it's Party Up, and then in quotations, Up in Here.
Which I think is probably the song that gained the most widespread traction. Not my favorite song, but of his catalog, that is. But the one I think that most people would know because everybody's heard it when they're out at some point. And obviously he passed away in the past week here. So we thought immediately that was a fitting choice for the music on this podcast.
Yeah, and happily it fits the theme too, because again, we've just passed another LSAT milestone. April's behind us. It's a good time if you're in the mood to celebrate. To do so, you've earned it.
Speaking of milestones, John, have you been vaccinated yet?
No, but given that I'm not as old as you, I didn't qualify for it until tomorrow. But I am going to try to get a vaccination this Friday, my first one. We'll see if
I
I can
I
get on the
have
schedule.
actually gotten mine, but remember, it's not age that qualified me; it was the
I know.
agricultural exemption.
I know. I just wanted to take a cheap shot because I'm jealous. I believe your
It's
wife
okay.
got, yeah, your wife got her first dose too. So congratulations, man. That really did relieve me.
It's nice, and I've noticed that we had a company meeting earlier today, and a lot of people were talking about they'd gotten theirs, and I was really pleased to see that because safety is the top priority for all of us and for anyone out there listening. So if you get that chance, go ahead and do it. I didn't have any side effects, which made me incredibly happy. A little bit of a sore arm, and I had Pfizer, and Amanda had a little bit more side effects. She had cold hands
Yeah.
and a sore arm, and the next day she couldn't lift her arm above her shoulder. And I was out there like doing jumping jacks, like, what's the problem?
I feel great.
Giving her a hard time about it.
Well, I'm excited for you guys. That really is, like I said, a huge relief. I'm looking forward to mine too. As much as I hate needles, I'll take one for the team when it comes to this.
Yeah, and speaking of a unrelated milestone and one that I consider to be a big negative, but certainly one that trends towards the law school world,
Hmm.
Notre Dame Law School did something really interesting last week as well, which was they closed their deposits early.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have too many words for this other than it's reprehensible and I think borderline immoral to go ahead and admit somebody and then tell them, oh, yeah, if you don't deposit, we'll let you know, but it could close. And then all of a sudden to start sending messages that send everyone into a panic. And by the end of the day, have closed it. And if you had been accepted to Notre Dame, and this was prior to April 15th, which is the day that most people think to themselves, that's when I have to deposit by. If you hadn't deposited, and that deadline, or that not even deadline, but that window closed, you went to the wait list.
Yeah.
So you were basically de-admitted, sent to the wait list. I'm sure they're going to try to let you in if things don't yield, but it created a panic wave across all applicants because I had people at other schools who were like, do I need to deposit? And of course, they immediately deposited just to
Sure.
cover themselves. Not cool by Notre Dame, a complete farce, I think, and I think they have been rightly criticized by some other deans, notably Dean Z in Michigan, and I think
Mm-hmm.
she's 100% right in saying this is something that is abhorrent and should never really happen. So, a
Yeah.
milestone and a bad one.
A negative one for sure. Yeah, this cycle's been strange, difficult, stressful enough. All the last year has been. There's no need for schools to pile onto that, and that's exactly what this has turned into. That's a real shame. I'm hoping not only have they learned their lesson, but the negative feedback puts any other schools who might have considered it in check.
Oh, yeah. I can tell you that when Notre Dame comes up in the future and we're talking about law school, I will remind people that they did this and
Mm-hmm.
that their actions were, I think, self-serving and thoughtless. So, and if somebody from Notre Dame wants to come on and talk about it, well, we'll have you. We might ask you a few questions about Amy Coney
You'll love
Barrett
it.
too, but we have some things to talk about.
Yeah, well, I'm sure with that warm welcome, we'll get lots of offers.
The dean of admissions will be on their way.
Yeah, they can't wait.
Let's get into the LSAT world because
Okay.
most of this podcast is the LSAT world, aside from us talking about masters and heritage stories.
And me, yeah, groaning about basketball. You turd.
Sorry.
It's all right. A lot of this does revolve around the April LSAT that just happens, and one thing that we constantly really hammer on when it comes to these tests is LSAT writing. It's separate from the test now, and as most people, I hope, know, if you do not have a submitted and approved writing sample, by the time score release comes around, they will not release your score. It just stays on hold until your writing is finished. So you have to get that done.
It's exactly the case. And that means for any first time LSAT takers out there for April, and there were plenty of them,
Lots of them, yeah.
you need to take that and take it soon. I would try to take it this week if you possibly can do so. There are still thousands of you who do not have an LSAT writing on record. Note that if you do have one already from a prior test, then this does not apply to you. You don't have to retake it. You will be able to get your score. This only applies to people who have not yet done any LSAT writing at any point in the past.
Given how many first-timers there are right now for April, people who just by definition don't have a writing sample on file, and that we want to make their lives easier, you want to run through just a quick list of things that either pro tips or things we've seen go wrong that are preventable.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is don't cause a security error, which means don't wear a smartwatch, don't have a cell phone right on the table with you, don't have a backpack behind you that might look suspicious. Make sure you show your ID to the camera very clearly and that it has a clear photo of you, and show your scratch paper, both sides of it, to the camera as well before you tear it up, just so that they can see, all right, these are the things we're concerned about. Oh, you took care of it. Thank you. And that'll pass you through as quickly as possible. If a security error does come up, typically what it does is just slows down the release of your LSAT writing results and thus your LSAT score. Just be aware that certain things are fatal to the session. If you have a smartwatch on and they see that, you're done for. They'll just cancel it. There's no like, hey, I didn't do anything with it. They don't want a smartwatch on you. Same thing with kind of like the phone right there on the table.
Desk. Right.
And it's easy to forget those things. And I've seen people be like, I knew the rules and I totally spaced. I'm like, sorry, there's nothing that can be done here. So you just have to go retake it, which is annoying and restarts the entire process from ground zero.
Yeah, it's not permanent or anything. It's just going to slow you down, but it's a hassle. If you have to do this essay once and be done with it, do it right. And we have released actually a couple of different free resources to help people out with this. I know we did, it feels like 6 years ago. It wasn't. It was 70 or so episodes ago. But we did a podcast episode solely on the digital writing sample, how it works, what to do, how to write the best one, what schools say they're looking for, how it's used. And there's also a blog post that gets a lot of traction on our blog, The Ultimate Guide to the LSAT Writing Sample, that'll walk you through start to finish how to do it.
Yeah, and that podcast episode is number 15, which should be in your Apple or Spotify or YouTube archives. It's also on our website. You can directly link to it from our podcast page.
Perfect.
The next big thing, aside from LSAT writing, is that now that the April LSAT is in the books for the most part, the next test is the June LSAT. And right now, this is looking large. It is 27,239 people registered as of, I think it was today that we were looking at that.
Yeah, it's recent.
Yeah, and so that's a lot of people. It will come down once the registration window closes. It's going to go up a little bit more. That's the first thing that'll happen, because when scores get released from the April LSAT, that is going to happen on April 29th, and then the registration deadline for June, when the window closes, is actually the next day, which is April 30th. So all of you who took the April test will have the ability to be like, all right, if I get a score on the first day, you can look at it and then immediately decide, do I possibly want to register for June or not? And then, once everybody's registered, we'll start to see the numbers slowly decrease because they see attrition for a whole bunch of different reasons. People pulling out, getting results from schools that they're happy with, deciding to postpone because they're not ready. We just saw that with April. Yeah. Thousands and thousands of people more were originally scheduled months ago, and then we ended up with something like 18,000 plus who ultimately took this test, but it was well over 20 earlier on in this year. So this is normal, this rise and fall as you go into each test.
Although I will say, if I'm putting money on this, and clearly my recent track record says I shouldn't, if I'm putting money on this, I would think that given that June's the last flex, a lot more people stick around for it than April. I knew they still had one more flex in the bag with June after April. That's my kind of guess. We'll see.
You call me mid-azalea sip there.
Okay. Well, then, for that, I do genuinely apologize.
No, you don't.
Though.
You're not
to put this in perspective, 27,000 people signed up almost 2 months early right now. Last year, for the June test, there were only 8,200 people. So fewer than a third, and we're still 2 months out.
And we were still in that pandemic kind of like situation where the May 2020 flex was the first one. There was uncertainty. There was access issues and so forth. So there are some reasons that number would have been so low, but this is a dramatically larger number no matter how you slice it. So I think it's probably going to stay, like you said, lot of people will think this is my last chance to get in on let's put it this way, the somewhat gravy train that has been the LSAT Flex. And if you're wondering why we would say that or what we're really referring to, a couple episodes ago we talked about why this law school admission cycle has been so competitive, and we talked about the big scoring bubble that has been produced by the Flex. So go back and listen to that, and that'll give you some contextual understanding of why we would be saying that and somewhat mocking, aspects of the test.
It's 81 for anyone who wants to go right to it.
Nice. Good reference. Couple episodes, too.
Two ago, yeah.
Right on the money.
You nailed it.
So let's get into this April 2021 test. The main test days that we had were Saturday, Sunday, and Tuesday. And then on Thursday, which is going to be the day this episode is released, there will be some paper and pencil test takers. So this isn't going to come out in the morning on Thursday. It's not going to come out first thing tomorrow morning. It's going to come out probably later on in the afternoon. So that is the majority of test takers. On Saturday, you saw about 6,600 people take the test. On Sunday, you saw about 6,300. On Tuesday, it continued to drop. It was 5,300. But I will note that also included international test takers.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about them as well during this episode. So if you took this test outside the U.S., and I had the pleasure of speaking to a number of you, we will actually talk about your exam as well. And there will be retakers, as always, next week. And typically they give that on Thursday, which I think would be the 22nd of April. And they don't release the numbers to us, but it's not going to be more than a few hundred ultimately that we would actually see. So in total, about 18,000 people over these 3 days. And I would say for me, John, and you might disagree with this, I thought Saturday was the smoothest of all 3 days overall. I felt that was a really good day in terms of like a minimal number of problems and fast onboarding times, very, very small wait. What's your take on it?
I completely agree. And it's a little counterintuitive in a way because it was actually the largest number of people taking it. Not by a huge margin, but it was the biggest day so far, biggest day of what will end up being the whole test. And it seemed really, again, I know it wasn't perfect for everyone. We say these things like this game is easier than another. We're not saying it's easy. Saturday was smoother than the others. We're not saying it's perfect. But it did seem like a good day on the whole, which again, every time that happens, I'm encouraged. Obviously grateful.
Yeah, I think on the whole, it's easy enough for us to be like, oh, it was a good day. But if you were one of those people who had problems, then it was a terrible day.
Yeah, it really stings to hear that, I know. So
it's either, hey, that was smooth, or, oh my God, I'm so mad. Interestingly enough, though, I know that in talking to LSAC throughout each of these test days, they were able to kind of like indicate that the wait times were relatively short. And even that the number of kind of like queries and problems being reported was less than what they've seen before with tests that were even larger in the past. And I think if we were to, graph this out, not that they're going to give us the data, we would see that as the longer the Flex goes on, the better they're getting at it, kind of like administering it. And again, one of the big problems I think here is that LSAC doesn't actually control all aspects of the supply chain here. Proctor U is involved in the actual test administration, and mostly what I'm seeing now when there are issues, it's something that Proctor U has done, or more specifically, one of their proctors. So let's talk a little bit about the issues that we saw, just to kind of like make sure that everybody's kind of, I guess, informed as to some of the things that you run into, and maybe there's more specific things that we saw. But again, I'll make the note, this wasn't bad on the whole. If you had an issue, it felt terrible and it was really, irksome, and might have caused you to, lose time or to reschedule or what have you. But on the whole, this was far fewer problems than, say, last summer, even earlier or late in the fall, or even earlier this year in January. So probably the most curious one that I saw, John, was this door issue.
Yeah, kind of. It's funny. I don't know why they take the background or whatever's kind of around you in the periphery of the room into such distinct concern. A television that's off, cover it. A window that doesn't have blinds, put a sheet up. A bookcase where they can't see the titles clearly. These are the kind of, put a towel over it. And an open door somewhere in the room. It was the kind of thing where they would force people to go and close it.
Or to shift their desks.
Yeah.
Multiple requests where it's like, we want to have the door behind you. There's only one conclusion from me in terms of why this might be coming down, and it's anti-cheating. They don't want any kind of communication through an open door, open window. And so having the door behind you means that you can't be looking over the top of your monitor at somebody through an open door, however that might work for them. I think that's what this is built around. But that put some people, I thought, in a really tough position. Some of the stories that I heard were, my room isn't set up to move this easily. Trying to do this was physically challenging. It's kind of like, this isn't what I expected, that I'd have to start moving furniture around. I didn't realize this was a home remodeling game
Right, yeah.
that I was involved in.
Last thing you need to be doing before the LSAT is like Property Brothers work. This is ridiculous.
Getting your heart rate up even more while you move your stuff around and wonder, will I be able to take this test? There were also some connections.
I saw one person put online like, man, it just felt like the feng shui was off as soon as I had to move the computer. I was like, fair enough.
My energy was not aligned properly.
Yeah, my chakras were all out of whack.
Marie Kondo was like, it does not please me. But, there was some connection issues. There's always that. I will say that some of the connection issues that we saw related to Macintosh operating system issues. And so there is a notice on the Proctor U website now about known Mac issues, and I would strongly recommend that everybody go there and take a look at that article if you are a Mac user, because there are some problems that crop up every time, and they're isolated to a couple different versions of the Macintosh OS. And so check those out for sure as well.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, to me, a lot of that's, first of all, very Proctor specific. Sometimes it's just a roll of dice with who's on the other side of the camera, what they ask of you, what they demand, and speaking of energy, the energy they give back. I'm still hearing stories of proctors who are like, today's going to be a great day. You're ready for this. You've got this. I love those stories, but go into it expecting that they could give you a little bit of unexpected feedback in terms of the instructions, what you have to follow. That's just part of it. I think if you can at least anticipate that to some degree, it doesn't throw you too far off your game.
And I'm also going to remind everybody to know your rights when it comes down to this. There's always a few stories about various items being said to be unusable when in fact we know they are not. This test iteration was no different. This always comes up. There's always some proctor who maybe hasn't been in the game for a while who shows up and is like, no, you cannot use pens.
Right.
Or you cannot use earplugs. The truth of the matter is there are many things that are allowed in the test room, but there are three things that keep coming up specifically. Number one, soft foam earplugs. You can use them. You do not have to ask permission. Number two, pens. You can use pens, pencils, mechanical pens, and those are all fine. And number three, for those of you who want to use it, Control F or Command F, the search function, it is usable. You do not have to ask your proctor for this. And again, I see this every time where I ask my proctor and the proctor said no. I'm like, sorry, I don't need to ask you. It's right on the LSAT website, or they have said through their administration directly to us, you can use Control F. There's no reason to clear something that is already usable. You're not causing a violation. Nobody cares. But a lot of proctors are like, I don't know. And then you're having an argument with a proctor over whether or not you can use pens. And you're right. How frustrating is that? Oh, I'm going to go ask my supervisor. And in one instance, in this case, I think I read it, the supervisor was like, nope, they're not usable. I'm like, jeez. Frustrating.
Yeah. In the old days, I knew people would like print out the LSAT website of all the permitted items and take them to test centers. You should still be able to do some form of that if things get heated to the point of like, I don't know, true contention.
Yeah, with Control F, I wouldn't even mention it because you don't need to.
No,
We'll just go ahead and do it. Now, if it does get it, I would have that printout. I'd be like, I'm going to go across my room and here's the page. Put it up to the screen with some force. Yeah. Be like, you can suck on that. So this is always one of those things. And again, this isn't like happening constantly. A lot of the proctor situations work out just fine. Sometimes the proctors are like what you said. It's going to be a great day. Good luck. How did it go? I hope it went well. You can do it. I'd like to see more of that because that's really awesome. But so that is one of those things.
Yeah, I mean, what happens if somebody does have an issue? Let's say it's an issue that they haven't overtly caused. What are the sources of remedy here?
Well, If it's a minor issue, probably nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, you can report the problem in the hopes that someone else doesn't have it. But sometimes there are minor delays. You might lose 15 or 30 seconds, something like that. In my experience at this point, they don't do anything about that. If you have a catastrophic problem, let's say you're in the middle of section 2, you lose connection and you're kicked out of the system and you can't get back in. So you took a test and a half. Usually what they will do is they will set you up with a retake that comes up the following week. So for April test takers, that would be next week. And notice that they've done that so they can give themselves plenty of time. They used to do it on Friday, and it was like, woo, they got to turn things around immediately. Now there's a little bit of time so they can say, let us work on it. But that's what you actually get if there is a catastrophic or fatal problem to your test taking experience, is you get a retake. And to answer several questions that I saw posted and one that was sent to me directly, no, you will not get the same test that you were already started on. I know that's the dream. Oh, I already saw all those questions and I thought about them. That's not how it works. They give you an entirely new version of the test when you get to it.
It's a fresh start, unfortunately, with new content. But I mean, you give a good example: the inability to start the test, the inability to finish it. In your example, like a section and a half, and that's the end. That's a perfect case for a makeup, and they'll grant it. Just with new content, I get that question all the time. Will they just let me finish that final passage because that's where it ended? Like, nah.
Yeah, I had that conversation. Got through the whole test. First 2 sections were great. I had a problem near the end of the third. Will they just let me retake that section? I'm like, I wish, but they will not, because at that point they consider it a security issue and that the integrity of the test is broken. For their purposes, it is safer to give you an entirely new test. And I know that feels unfair, and I think it is unfair. If you've got 2 sections in the book, I think maybe they could work something out where they're like, all right, we'll give you just a new third section. But that's the way this works, unfortunately.
Imagine your car breaking down like halfway through a road trip, and to fix it, you have to start back at your house again. Like, that's kind of what it feels to me. It's like, I'm almost there. Nope, we're towing you home.
No, you're on the street of your destination. You can see the house that you're going to, and they're like, no, back to the beginning of the trip. That's terrible.
It stings. But, again, it's one of those things where better to know the outcomes of this stuff, even if you don't agree with them or like them.
Yeah, and if you did have a problem and it was serious, use that complaint form in your LSAC account. They have told me repeatedly that is the thing that they are monitoring more so than anything else. That's the one where they have eyes on that queue constantly. So easy enough to get right to that and get to the people who can actually handle it. A lot of times the first level phone answerers are not the people who are going to be handling this. They're going to pass you off, so use the complaint form.
Yeah, they put it in there for a reason. It's more efficient for them, but it also makes things consistent in terms of what people know to think. We're dispelling with some common misconceptions here. Will I get the same test or not? How do I report this? Let's do one or two more that I think will lead us into the test talk.
Let's talk a little bit about what we see after the test when people are talking about this, and the information that you can disclose, as well as what that means when you're talking to other people. The first thing is for years now, LSAC has not really had a problem with people saying, I had this game, or I had logical reasoning that included a question about, let's say, Mars, as we will talk about in a little bit. And so you're allowed to talk about that. What they don't want is they don't want you getting out there and talking about this was the rule wording, and the answer to that was A, and this is how long, this was going to take, or anything where it really is kind of prejudicial about the content. So talking about something and saying it's a Mars question really doesn't tell anybody anything. And if you go out and you talk about this rule is really challenging and this is how it's interpreted, that is a problem. And so you can't get specific about solutions, rules, answers, anything like that. But one of the things that happens then is that you see people online talking about this, and there's always some consternation. It's okay to do that. They've already kind of shown that. You can go back on almost any LSAT forum and find posts from many years past where they have disclosed a ton of information about this. I will remind everybody when they're going through the test day, because I always see this. I started to see it early on Saturday when the reading comprehension was causing some issues for people. And then again on Sunday when the same thing was happening. Later test takers freaking out. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to get a hard reading comp.
Mm-hmm.
Section orders change throughout the day. So you might have to take the test on Saturday morning, and by the time you get to Saturday night, sections have already changed out. It also means that when that's happening, just saying, oh, I had this section order, RC, LR, LG, that's meaningless.
Yeah.
You can't tell what the other person had just based on that any longer. They could have had a completely different RC section and LG and LR, as the case may be. So as you're kind of like working through that and you're looking at other people, be aware of that fact. You have to understand the test format. I mean, this is about information. And one of the things that I know you and I are very committed to, John, is the idea of putting out maximum amount of information so that if you're a test taker, when you go in to take this exam, you know as much as you possibly can about the circumstances, the environments, you're right, what can happen during the test, before the test, and after the test. And so just be careful. Also be careful when you're talking about certain topics, because as we're going to see, they are seeding sections with similar topics. Mars, I've used Mars as a great example. Mars occurred in more than one LR section, as we'll see. So did Van Gogh, for that matter. So sometimes I saw people saying, oh, I had Van Gogh too. And I'm like, yeah, but you had a different test and don't realize it.
Yeah.
It
Was
was a
it
different
January, Dave,
LR.
where there were the 2 questions about bacteria and water? There were 2 questions about velociraptor claws or something like that.
Yep, dinosaurs and stuff like that.
Yeah. So you said before, you're allowed to say Mars, and in my head I'm thinking, but please don't say more than that, because you're actually, it begins to get confusing. Don't give away the question type or strategies or anything, but to say, like, it was a meteorite made of these things on Mars. Oh, mine was about an asteroid that bumped into Mars and could have caused a life extinction. That splits the questions, not in a way that's helpful to anybody, but it is helpful to us. So if I sound like I'm on my knees begging right now, that's actually a pretty good picture of it.
Well, as we get into the discussion of the content, I will say that every one of these flex tests is so challenging because there's just so much information out there.
Yeah.
There are questions that I think even still, John, with the repository and archive that we have of all the prior experimental uses, and we have many of these pinned down as to where they were used. There's sometimes questions where I look at, I'm like, I just don't know where that goes.
Yeah.
I don't know which section this fits into. And it's always a challenge. I feel like there's always a little bit that we miss because of that. And that's, not abnormal. Also hindering people is that, and I think it's another good reminder, taking a real LSAT is not the same as taking a practice test. You do not feel the same afterwards. For most people, their memory is deeply impaired. They don't recall things clearly, and they're not certain, and it was all a blur. And so a lot of times I see people walking out and they're like, that was the hardest test ever. And I'm like, no, that wasn't the hardest test ever, but that was your first real test, and real tests are way worse than any practice test. Or you see the other thing is like, that was harder than any practice test I took. I'm
Right.
like, that's correct, because you didn't take a practice test. You just took a real test, and the pressure is on. Now you know it counts. Everything in your body is tense. You're in predator mode. You got endorphins rushing through your body. It's not the same thing as when you sat down on a Tuesday afternoon. You're like, I'm going to take PT 81. Oh, if I didn't do well, it's not on my record. It's not permanent. Think about your emotional makeup during these 2 events and realize that causes a negativity bias.
Yeah.
Everybody walks out of the test saying it was hard. That is just a universal thing. I'm fortunate because I've been able to see it for years and years. And so now I understand that, but it is something that most people who are new to the process are like, oh no, it was the worst. I'm like, it wasn't the worst. It was hard. There's no doubt about that, but it probably wasn't the worst ever.
Yeah. I'm chuckling at predator mode because I'm sure there's at least half as many people that would be out there saying, "Oh, I was in prey mode." EY and AY, frankly.
You and I always preach getting into predator mode and that you're
Yeah.
60 feet tall and everybody else can just be stepped on and the test can be stepped on. That's our test mentality mindset where we're like
Sure.
crush and destroy. So take that for what it is. But sometimes the test eats you. Hopefully you eat the test.
The windshield or the bug. Yeah.
Get into it.
Let's do it. And we'll start in the beginning. Start with Saturday morning.
You want to run through it or you want me to?
Um, yeah, I can start. I mean, there's so much to cover here. I don't think anybody's going to feel like they were, short-sold. There's a lot going on, as we'll see through these 3 or 4 days of testing.
Yeah.
Saturday was all domestic, so North American LSATs. We'll focus on that. And happily, or at least I know I was happy about it, we woke up and started seeing some early reports that we were able to very quickly identify as the October 2019 LSAT. A non-disclosed test, of course, but it was one that we were very familiar with. It was only about 18 months old, and it was a pretty big one.
Yeah. We had a lot of information on this test, not just from that usage, but as we'll see, like the reading comprehension on that test had been used previously as like June 2018 experimental.
Yeah, that's right.
So we had a trove of this. And I think I sent you a message relatively early on Saturday because I'm usually up a little bit before you are. That was like, it's October 2019. Thank God. We can like relax a little.
Yeah, I think the first thing I did Saturday was check my phone, see it, and hit snooze.
Yeah. I knew you went back to
"All
sleep,
right."
and I was like, it's okay, man. I'll take care of it.
Well, let's talk
Let's,
about the first thing that people were reporting to us, and one of the easier moments on this test to identify, which is the logic games. I'll touch on the 4 games that we saw, 23 questions in this section. I think this is in order, but just in case, grain of salt.
it is.
One game, I thought so, about attorneys and assigning cases to them, to people at a firm. Second game in there was presentations at a book club. Interestingly, the third game was about a bookstore employees stocking shelving shifts. And then finally, pretty common theme, travel guides giving tours in a few different countries. It was Uruguay and Venezuela over, if I recall, several months.
Yeah, you saw that game mentioned as tour guides, travel, South America game, countries game, had a lot of different names, which, generally would be, I think this is one of the reasons it's challenging to do this for most people is like, well, one game's got 4 different names to it.
Yeah.
Once we saw certain things about it, we're like, okay. And then I got some reports back independently, and I was like, all right, I know that one. This is a section where really the latter half of it, I think, is the harder part of it. And
Yeah.
there was a range of reaction. I saw people, and I know people who had said to me, I didn't have a problem with that. I knew how to set it up. It took me a little bit with that 4th game, but once I figured it out, I had enough time to get through it. To, on the other end, this was impossible to do, and I'm never traveling to South America. Both reasonable responses. It's all about how it affects
Yeah.
you. We'll talk about how this affects the scaling at the very end and put it all together. This does have an effect on the scale, maybe not as much as most people would hope, but it will have an effect, and I think kind of a special effect. So we'll get to that. Next section you had from the same test was reading comprehension. And I'm not as sure that this is in order as I am with logic games, but that's because I'm so tired I can't remember. The first passage, or one of the passages, was about jazz and Latin. Then there's a passage that a lot of people found rather challenging. You can call it different things, but really volcanoes is the easiest way to take a look at it. But kind of like ice volcanoes. And so that was a science-based passage that is difficult. And we saw this throughout the test week. It was used Saturday, Sunday, and Tuesday. Then you had one that I think was easier, and that was about kind of like biking, camping, parks, specifically in Banff, Canada.
Yeah.
When this has come up before, I've always said the same thing. Seen pictures of Banff and Lake Louise. It looks awesome. There's that cool hotel right on the banks of Lake Louise.
Yeah.
I want to go there, but I haven't been. And obviously, the pandemic means I haven't traveled at all. But that sounds like a passage that I would enjoy reading.
I'll be honest with you. I felt that way about the whole section. I felt it 2 Octobers ago. When I was hearing the games and the reading comp come up, I was like, all right. Somebody said to me about the games, they're like, man, I had this really hard game on books about halfway through the day. I was like, come on, dude, there were 2 games about books. What does that do for me?
This is where the challenge is. I mean, clear information after the test. It's kind of like, the way I look at it is we've got a ton of internal information, but we have to externally connect it. And of course, we have sources that are not just students that we can refer to. But if a bunch of other sources all have the same type of games, that might make it easy for us to figure those games out, but less easy to figure out others. And so it's always about like, be specific. The fourth and final passage on that section was a rough one. And I would really love to read this too, because intellectual property is something that I know a fair bit about and I find very interesting. And that's what the fourth passage was about, was intellectual property and ownership. And this was the comparative. Maybe, I think it was the fourth passage, but
I
these are the
believe
four
so.
passages in total. This was a hard passage as well. So that, if you went through that and you're like, that worked me over, you were not alone. I think everybody felt that there were some really difficult moments in this section.
All right, you want me to take an LR? Maybe both?
Let's do it.
Yeah. Um, Still more of the same. Essentially, Saturday morning was the entire October 2019 test. So we've talked games, we've talked reading comp, and then we started seeing both logical reasoning sections from October 2019 in use. One of them was there were some questions about a fish with this sounded interesting to me, translucent head, two eyes on the same side. Sounded like a flounder or something.
Yeah, being on the bottom of the seafloor looking up.
Which is what you would get with that kind of body type. Building boats, hiring fishermen. There was another one about nuts and weight loss. I'm saying another one because there was a really hard question in January about walnuts and weight loss, and the same thing there. But nuts making people fat, apparently. And it was one about political campaigns and organizational skills. All of those were in a single section on Saturday morning from October 2019. A reasonable section from what I was hearing about it. I think it was pretty middle of the road.
Yeah, I think both the LRs from October 2019 were pretty reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And we saw versions of the other one too. The other LR from that test, also relatively fair, had to do with like squids. I think that was also the one with internet search engine results about political extremism. Vegetarianism was in there, but vegetarianism appeared on several sections. Again, there was one about a Jupiter-sized moon orbiting a star. And so that was the other section there. And it's interesting because I think we have a tremendous amount of information about this particular test at this point. And even still, sometimes I'm like, wait, was that section, did that have this question or was it in the other section? It can be a challenge. But that was the entire use of October 2019 as far as we could tell. They used those four sections, and that immediately created two forms because you could have the one LG and the one RC and then two different LR that were floating around out there. But early on Saturday, you saw a lot of people talking about the tour game, talking about the intellectual property passage, and we're like, yeah, they're all having the same thing. And that continued throughout the weekend. People had it on Sunday as well as Tuesday. And then you had those two LR. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think for us, the other sections that we saw that kind of started to creep in, they mixed in a second test on Saturday, from what we could tell. The second test is really pieced together. I think it's a new complete test of four sections that they had, but they had, in some cases, pulled it from various experimentals. For example, we saw stuff from January of 2019 that they'd used as an experimental. But then there were some things on here we couldn't tell. There was reading comprehension that they pulled from this test, which we'll talk about, where we're like, we don't see the actual prior use of it anytime in the last few years. And I didn't have time to go back further than that in checking the archives. But the two LRs that they appeared to have used both came, at least in part, if not whole, from September 2018 as experimental sections. And I can just say quite bluntly and forthrightly, we had some challenges figuring these out. I think we really spent a lot of time trying to separate them out. And part of the reason is that this is where we saw questions on the same topic. And that's where it really gets challenging. So I'll just go through the two, and these should be pretty accurate. Both of these sections were fair. I will say that much for the feedback I heard. The first one was a section that had something about geese, cackling geese.
Right.
And I think maybe nesting was in on that as well. It also had a question on philosophers and physicists, and I think maybe totalitarian regimes. This one had a Mars meteor that was made of nickel and iron, as well as frowning, and then a discussion of like bad art in a cafe. It was like a comparison.
Yeah, to museums or something, one. Cafe art or sidewalk art or something, I think is what that one was.
Yeah, and then this one also had a Van Gogh question. I think the Moonrise Van Gogh is in the other section that's coming up. This one was about like painting over a canvas. I'm trying to make sure I've got that right. Maybe I should
No, I'm fairly certain
Yeah,
that's correct.
that is
Memorize, I
exactly
think,
right.
didn't come up until maybe Tuesday.
This is
This
the
is
challenge.
hard. You think about what
Yeah.
this means too. We haven't even gotten to the fourth LR section of Saturday morning, really.
Yeah. And that the third one we were able to, pick up, but then we ran into a problem because there was another Mars question. The one question's got Mars meteor made of nickel and iron. That was the passage I just talked about with the geese and the frowning and so forth.
Yeah,
There's another section, as far as we can tell. Again, we're just being honest about this. That was more about um, kind of like, what was it?
an asteroid.
Asteroid
Yeah.
and a life on Mars and Earth, and then bees and pollen. I think there were some other questions that were in here as well about poetry and stickers on produce and so forth. But this was a section where it was very indistinct to us. And, let's be honest, one of the things that we're not doing is we're not just kind of like saying, put it all online or anything like that. So there's some variation here in terms of what we're looking at. But as far as we can tell, that is another section that was used as an experimental section a couple of years back in September 2018. And maybe even in part of January 2019, because we see uses of questions back then about Mars and female birds and apparently cackling and so forth. It's like, this
Yeah, there
is the
was
problem.
female birds and noises that they make, and it's like, are those geese?
Yeah, well, somebody it becomes a Mars expert and they write 10 questions on Mars, and over somebody's like, I had a Mars question. I'm like, uh-huh. Which one?
Go on. It's a lot
Yeah.
of that. But yeah, at this point, we've got about 100 LR questions, a little over, floating around, some of which overlap in topic, all of which overlap in time. It's just a beast to sift this out perfectly. But what I can say, and I do feel very confident about this, all four of the sections that we saw to this point on Saturday were very similar, I think, in terms of fairness and overall difficulty. I didn't see like one standout gimme. I didn't see one standout, real punishing section either.
Yeah, and by the way, we're only halfway through the number of sections. We've covered 6 sections so far. There were at least 12 that were used. So we're only
Well, yeah,
halfway through.
I'm further than that on my drink, so we may have to speed up.
This is actually pretty good.
I'm digging it.
Every time you've been talking, I'm like, man, a little more of this. So let's continue on with sections that we saw predominantly throughout the weekend because they really seem to have drawn on these 2 tests. And we started to see a little bit later on Saturday a new reading comprehension section that was 27 questions, if I recall. And this had some difficulty to it as well. There was a passage about rational choices with lawyers and legal bias. I saw it referred to as counterfactuals at one point. That was not an easy passage. There was another passage in this section about Mexican murals and another one about water subsidies that in developing countries. This was the comparative passage. And then one about birds, apparently blue jays or scrub jays, and what's happening during experiments and deception there. And I heard, some comments that were negative about the difficulty here as well, the birds passage and also the rational choice one, the legal bias one, however you want to actually describe that. So that was a challenge as well. But they've kind of flipped that in a little bit later on Saturday. And you and I always have the same thing at about like 4:00 Pacific on the weekend. We're like, let's hope they're done.
Yeah, I'm very ready to wash my hands of it all at that point. And then we, at the 11th hour, they'll throw in some new section. And we're like, oh man, here we go.
I'll get some report that's like, I had a passage about Mexican murals. And I'm like, what?
No, you didn't.
That's new. I'm like,
No, you
damn.
didn't. Hush.
And we're also watching the Masters and stuff like that. So I think we were otherwise engaged. You want to cover the logic games that showed up that day as well?
Yeah. Wildly enough, we're still not quite finished with Saturday because there was another section of games that got introduced. So this will be the second set of games. We've already done 4 LRs and 2 RCs. This was much later into Saturday that we started seeing this. First game was about letters of the alphabet. Not too bad from what most people said. It was a game about trainers and fitness. The one I probably heard the most of, either this one or the final game, was this game about 4 teams of 2 with mechanical engineers and maybe mechanics. Again, this sort of lost in translation that you sometimes see. And then a game, the other one that was getting a lot of noise, districts and grants, funding different projects like I think the roads and parks, things like that. That was a hard game.
Yeah, saw a lot of complaints about that. funny comments that people were making about I'll never be, giving any grants to these parks or anything like
Yeah,
that.
that's right. Screw you, Yosemite. Which is sacrilege, but I get the feeling. This at least some of these games we could spot back from experimental games in January of 2019. So these were at
Yeah.
least a little more relatable in terms of where they'd come from. But none of these that we saw later into the day on Saturday was from a previous scored section of a test that we could tell.
Yeah. Looks like it was a bunch of experimentals. So they took, to start this off, they used the October 2019 LSAT all over again. It looks like they had a second LSAT ready to go that they then mixed in. And so that's 2 complete LSATs, 2 logic games, 2 reading comprehensions, 4 logical reasonings. And you can see how many choices that they have at that point. You've got 16 forms rolling around. It's a challenge to figure it out. And that's where somebody is like, oh, I had the same order as you. I'm like, which of the 16? Because it's not just 16 test forms. That's the content. When you start talking about putting in additional orders, and whether they had logic games first or third, then it obviously explodes in terms of the number of possible options there. But that was largely what we saw being used over the weekend. That wasn't the only thing that we saw, all right, because they used the next test that we're going to fold in, and we're going to talk about this slightly separately because it really had 2 uses. And again, making it more challenging. So that was Saturday and Sunday primarily. So just bear with us on that. Then we go through Monday, and I think, John, you and I slept at least 12 hours.
That's impressive. I'm not sure how long I slept, so it might have been 12. I might have slept through Monday. I don't know.
Might have been 16. So then Tuesday dawned, and of course the international LSATs are now added into this whole thing. And international LSATs are unusual in the sense that they often get a different test than the North American test takers. They also do it regionally, or they have in many cases, where European test takers get one version, test takers in Asia get a different version. And so they kind of like have kept this separated, primarily to fight off time zone cheating.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that didn't happen entirely because we had test takers in certain instances getting the same test in various zones. And sometimes what happened with international test takers is they gave them a lot of the sections that had been used on the weekend. But very early on Tuesday, I think it was like 7:30 in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
I was pleased to see that the test that they were using was one that we were really familiar with. They went back and they used a test that originally had been given in September of 2016 in Europe.
Yes.
So it was an international LSAT. And they've reused this before. This isn't the first time this has come up. They used it in August of 2020 in its entirety, and they used parts of it again in October of 2020. So this is a test that we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I saw people coming in saying, these were the sections they have, and I knew or strongly suspected that they were outside the country. And so you'd be like, that person was in China, for example, or Ghana, or wherever the case may have been. And so it's kind of cool, especially when those people reach out and I end up talking to them. I really enjoy that. Or if I've reached out to them, it's a cool conversation because I love talking to people around the world. But let's go through this test, and we're going to isolate it by itself so that the international test takers who had this form will understand what it is, and then we'll include it in the matrix because these 4 sections, not only did they, were used for the international test, but at times they mixed them with the weekend sections.
Mm-hmm. On Tuesday,
yeah. So they weren't just in isolation, but a lot of international test takers ended up taking this exam. So I know that might be confusing. It'll hopefully all be able to be fitted together nicely at the end, but this is the challenge. I think this is one of the things where I know, John, that when you and I get to August, we both have deep reservations about our ability to track what's occurring in August and later.
If we get to August, but yeah, I'll take your point.
Glass half empty today. What's going on, man?
Yeah, I think that's what's going on. Is it is about half empty, and
hopefully
August. If you're not sure what we're referring to of this year, they're going to add in a 4th section, an experimental, which is going to muddy these waters even more. So
it's going to muddy it so much that I think it's going to be impossible to see through. Because imagine this: right now, every question that we see, we know is real. What do you think is going to happen when a quarter of them aren't?
Yeah. I know that's rhetorical because you and I both know what's going to happen.
Yeah,
It's going to be chaos, utter
it's gonna be
madness.
less accuracy. So, John, run us through that September 2016 European test. Tell us what's on each of the
Sure,
sections.
I'll bounce through these quickly. And again, this is the August 2020 domestic test as well for anyone who wants a more recent instance. Start with games. 4 games. There was one about witness sequencing. The hardest game, probably, or at least a hard one that I heard about, was music recitals, students with different instruments. I think this is violinists, pianists. An arts and crafts game, mosaics and origami, stenciling. And then a game about accountants and printing, verifying transactions with
Which I think
accountants.
was also challenging,
Oh,
that
it's a
game
tough
as
one, yeah.
well.
Yeah. Although on the whole, and we'll talk more about this, I don't know that this was quite as challenging as the Saturday games that we had seen.
I can tell you that it was. We previously have talked about this, and after having looked at it pretty closely, had concluded that this was a scale mover. So we'll have to talk about those 3 sections in comparison. But
That's
we have
interesting.
very specific thoughts about it.
Um, yeah, it's funny. Maybe it was just because I had heard so much about that test previously being rough that I didn't get the same level of feedback this time. But yeah, if I extend my memory a little bit further, I think I might have undersold it just now.
Yeah, I think what had happened was is that you on I don't think you were not feeling well on Tuesday, and so I spent a lot of
Yeah.
time working on this, and so I saw the kind of like the feedback a little bit more, but also we had the feedback from before. We'd already made a determination on this a while ago.
Oh, yeah. I knew we had. That makes our life easier. I think I still probably feverish from Tuesday. Let's call it that.
All right, what about the RC?
Yeah. I think in order American Indians, Native Americans, indigenous arts. And there was a passage about domesticated dogs responding to human commands. I remember this one well versus wolves and apes, chimpanzees. I'd love to read that. Um, the other one that I'm interested in here was about Myra Clark Gaines. A Notorious Woman was the name that got put on this back in August and
Yeah,
September.
wills
Um,
and heredity,
yeah, Wills and
inheritance.
Heredity. And then there was one about the European Union regulation with monopolies and free trade, economic principles, basically, and that was comparative.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. 2 LRs from that test got used as well. So the whole thing. One, this is your Van Gogh reference from before. This is where that Van Gogh moonrise appeared, the time it was painted. There was one about sleep quality, the ability to perform some trained task with different levels of sleep quality. Dinosaurs eating rocks. No idea what that's about. Sounds interesting. I have an idea of what it's about, but GDP is a measurement. There was one about C13, some chemical, presumably.
You think that dinosaurs eating rocks is about digestion?
I'm certain it is because birds are ancestors.
Yeah.
Yeah, dinosaurs are ancestors of modern birds. Lots of birds eat rocks to help the digestive process. That's my guess.
Yep.
And then the other LR, which had Marxism, another one on asteroids, although this was not the same as the Mars asteroid Earth life impact from earlier. A really notorious question on this was about medieval crests, lions and leopards. There was one about carpenter bees, magazine publishing guidelines. All of those appeared in the other section.
Yeah, so that was the sections that were primarily used for international tests. But if you saw those on the weekend, or if you were a North American test taker who saw those on Tuesday, no surprise. It might have been used a little bit less than the first 2 tests, so to speak. At least the LR, LG, RCs that we've talked about. But then that gets us through 12 total sections that we get down to. And so technically at that point, you have 54 possible outcomes in terms of test forms and just content. You've got 3 logic games, 3 reading comprehension, and then 6 logical reasoning. I will say this, I don't think all 54 were used. I think some of these are combinations that are essentially impossible because they didn't use that last test, the September 2016 kind of like Tuesday International test, as much in combination with the earlier sections. But they definitely did it at times because I know for a fact that I was seeing some kind of commingling between like LG from one test and RC from a different test. But that is where we get to, 54 different possible. Maybe they had 36 that they use, maybe 40. It's really difficult to figure out, but you can see that a lot of this stuff's been used before.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a constant reuse, and this is completely normal. Now, I know some people are like, how do you know it was reused?
Right.
because we were doing this back then. We've been doing this forever. In fact, we have records that extend back into the 1990s on experimental sections. And a lot of those questions have subsequently been used. And so those records don't necessarily help us. But we've been able to stretch back into, say, 2008, 2006 and find questions that they've used just this year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's because we can go back. The next question that people will say is, where can I get my hands on those questions if they've been administered before? The sad answer is you cannot. You know that sometimes tests are non-disclosed. The reason they're non-disclosed is so they can reuse them. The other thing is that tests in the past used to have experimental sections. That's what's going to be added back in August. And those experimental sections are tested and pre-tested so they can then use them on today's tests. So I can say, yes, there was a game or a reading comprehension passage about Mexican murals in the past, but it doesn't mean that there's a place where you can go and actually get your hands on it, unfortunately.
Yeah, in fact,
That
if
would
there
be a
was,
problem.
you wouldn't be seeing it now.
Yeah, you shouldn't.
Right, you shouldn't be seeing it now, at least.
That's exactly right. So we may know a fair amount about it, but the actual text of it is not something that we have. And so then we get down to, I think, what is, the real point of interest for everybody, which is, all right, you guys know what's on there. You have a pretty good sense if everything was in there. And I'll be honest, that's 12 sections. I'm not even entirely certain that that is everything, although I feel pretty confident that we've reached the maximum. This is now the second time we've seen 54 possible combinations. I think that's the highest. And like I said, I don't think they used all of them. The question that we always get prior to us making these predictions is, how do you do it? Now, I always want to say the same thing, magic. It's always my first answer. It's magic. But it gets asked every single time. So we really do want to address that and help people understand that. And you might be able to tell right away that when we're able to go back and say, oh, we saw this in September of 2016 on the European test, we have prior knowledge. For better or worse, a lot of our competitors out there, they don't have this. They either don't have history or they didn't track it or they didn't think that it was important at that time. We did. We just kept records. That's probably my fault because that's just the way I am. And I was like, write down everything. So we have like these crazy archives where I can see them using tests over and over again. But the archive that we have is extensive. It's been developed over years. There is no other company out there that has anything like it. I guarantee that. And so this allows us to see these questions, and you have to remember every single question that appears on an LSAT had to be pre-tested as an experimental at some point or as a non-disclosed test, and usually as an experimental before that. So we know that these are out there. And we also have reports that come in from our instructors and other teaching professionals and development professionals here that helps us connect all the dots together. And we obviously track what students say online. That's the fastest way to start getting a sense of what's going on. And so we can kind of combine all of those. And then, the truth is, Jon and I have been doing this for decades. He might not want to admit it, but we have a lot of experience with it. And that helps us shape this together. But we always say the same thing. This is an estimation. We try to be conservative. Yeah. The whole goal here is to not create some pie in the sky ideal. And I'd rather be conservative than liberal. So if we were looking at a test and we're like, it could be anywhere from, 8 to 9, we're probably going to say that it's 8 because that gives you the worst case scenario when you're making this judgment. And it also means that if you're a pretty knowledgeable test taker, you're somebody who's been scoring and say in the 170s on your practice tests, you've got a real confident feeling. If you're like, I think it was easier than that or it was harder than that, go with your own feeling. We're all right with that. If that was your test that you took and you think that you know what you're talking about, trust yourself.
Yeah. We say it every time. We're going to err on a slightly cautious note here. If we err, which hopefully not. But you have to use your own best judgment too. Compare this to practice tests, to how you felt. Compare it to past LSATs, frankly, because those are an even better analog. You may find that you need to move the scale for yourself up or down by 1 because of your experience with it. That's okay.
Yeah. The thing to watch out for is what I mentioned earlier, though. I just took this. It was my first test. And it was the hardest thing in the world. It feels that way. And I'm not discounting your feelings on it. I know that it actually is a draining experience, obviously. It's just that colors your perception. It's the kind of thing where your first marathon, man, it feels like that was the hardest thing you ever did. And it may very well have been. But your 25th marathon doesn't feel as bad because you have full expectation. And in this case, practice tests, as useful as they are, as essential as they are, do not exactly replicate the mental drain and kind of like focus loss that you experience during the real test. So let's go through the 12 sections that we just talked about. I'll mention that because of some reuses and overlaps and LSAC is trying to keep people from seeing sections that someone might have seen before. There may be a section or two that isn't talked about here that a few people might have had. Because usually if a section's only been given to a very small number of people, there's just not enough information for us to say for sure that it was used. Let's start with logic games,
Right.
which I think is going to be, as it always is, partially controversial.
There's no way around that.
I'm hesitating.
Buckle up.
All right, let's start off with the 3 logic game sections. All right, the first one was the October 19 section, as we're calling it. It was the attorney cases, the book club, then the stocking the bookshelf shifts, and then the tours down in the countries in South America. Look, I can see arguments either way for this, that either it has no effect or it loosens the scale. All right, so I know no one's going to be happy when we say that it has no effect. But what I'm really going to call this is 0.5, and I'm going to explain this. Because I think it's important to understand how scales can change. Scales aren't rigid. 2 scales could be exactly the same and be like -8 at 170, and then one of those scales could be looser at 160 than the other. And that's because difficulty isn't continuous. There's top-line difficulty, there's mid-level difficulty. It's my perception that this particular logic games that we're talking about doesn't change the 170 scaling, but would loosen the 160 scaling. So, at 170, we're talking about missing 7, 8, 9 questions on a test, typically. That's not a whole lot of room. This section, I think it's hard. I think there are hard questions, but at the 175 level, they're not giving you credit for that. They just expect you to do well. However, if you're scoring 162, you have more latitude. And that's why I say 0.5 applies to this section. It's kind of like it doesn't change 170, but it will loosen the scale further as you move down into the 160s and ultimately into the 150s. John, do you think that makes sense in terms of how I explained it?
It definitely makes sense to me because we talk about it a lot and we agree. What I often say to people is the thing that you probably are missing in that 6, 7, 8, 9 questions at the 170 level, games don't account for a huge number of those misses, if any. Typically, people who are performing that well have got games so locked down and perfected that unless something genuinely apocalyptic happens, then a hard section of games is still pretty survivable there. But further down, if this was the sort of section at a 164 or 166 or 158, I think this would loosen the scale possibly more than a point further down.
Yeah, we had some pretty high scores take this section, and I heard repeated comments to the effect of, yeah, it took me a second, but once I had the setup in my mind, I nailed this. Or I got to the very last game and I had 12 minutes to do it. And that's what you get with people who are scoring that highly. And then that's also why you might see the next person who's like, that game section worked me. And they'd previously been scoring in the 160s. And it's like, there are differences as people kind of like progress through the curve. And so I feel like this section, as well as the next one we're going to talk about, both have the same effect. They're not moving 170, but they're moving 160 and 150 and giving extra space there. So we're trying to acknowledge we think both these sections are hard. We just don't think they're moving it.
Yeah, there's a different target audience who are really suffering from this.
So let's go to the second section, which we know partially was used in January of 2019. It was the funding projects for sure was used then. But this was the game about the 4 teams of 2, like the mechanical engineers as game 3, and then the districts and grants as game 4. And I think trainer and fitness was game number 2. This is the same thing. At 170, it doesn't move the needle, but it really does move the needle as you continue going down because it's kind of like, it's not really enough to push it at 170, but it certainly has an effect lower. And I've kind of, in my mind, just denoted that as like a 0.5. Like it moves it, but it's not going to move it the way you think. So That's the way that one works. And then previously, the game that comes from September of 2016 in Europe, which is the origami and pottery, the music recital, and then the accountant game about printing and verifying, which is the fourth game. We've already established on previous podcasts that this was a harder section and that would, in fact, loosen the scale at 170 by 1. So if you had the first two, and you're looking at the 170 prediction, do not move your prediction. It's 0 and 0. If you had that accountant's game at the end with the printing and verifying, you can add 1 from the scale. And what that means is we start at -7. So for those of you who had the first two sections, you're still at -7 for 170. For those of you who had the printing and verifying game, you're now at -8 for 170. And that is the scale/curve, a number of questions you can miss to achieve a 170 on this test. Jon, you want to do RC?
I'm fine with that so far. Yeah. I'm sure someone's scrabbling out a furious letter, banging on a keyboard somewhere.
Don't do it, Karen.
Don't do it. We're trying to do this for you. Let's talk RC. So we saw two sections of it, first on Saturday, through the day on Sunday, still in use on Tuesday, and then a third that got introduced on Tuesday, mixed in. The first, again, was from October 2019. This is the one about jazz, volcanoes, something about Indonesian volcanoes, camping and cycling, and then Dave's favorite, intellectual property. 27 questions, and this section was hard. I would add 1 to the curve from this, or loosen the curve by 1 from this section.
Yes.
So if you tested Saturday or Sunday or whenever and saw those passages, bump it up 1 more. If you were at a 7, go to 8. If you were at an 8, go to 9. The other thing we saw first introduced Saturday and then used throughout was an RC section on, this was the Mexican murals in the 30s, rational choices, water subsidies, the one about birds, scrub jays, I think.
Mm-hmm.
This is another hard section from what I could gather from it. Another one that I would put in the loosen the curve by 1 category.
And you can see the modern kind of like ethic in their mind. RC has just been consistently hard in recent years. It's just I think they've discovered that's the easiest place for them to really like ratchet up the difficulty and to really make it a challenge no matter what scoring level you're at. And both of those are going to loosen the curve by 1. So yeah. I think hopefully that'll make some people happy.
But in particular, I think it's the easiest place to make difficulty appear for the highest level scorers. The 170 people, they seem to be the most affected by a difficult RC, less so by a really challenging set of games.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, again, why when we talk about the skill at this level, we're probably more conscious of what RC is doing to it. Let's talk about the one from September 16 in Europe, August 2020. First, you saw internationally on Tuesday. This was the one with the dogs and the wolves, Native American art, Notorious Woman, and then the monopolies, the European Union monopolies. This one, to me, didn't feel so bad. I'm not calling it easy. I would call this a medium section. I don't think this would do anything to the curve at a 170. That's my take.
So that takes us through reading comprehension.
Yeah. Any disagreements there? You feel okay about it?
I'm fine with it.
Okay.
Like I said, I know some people out there are going to be like, well, no, that was an easy RC. And you're saying that it was hard. Remember, this is an individual result. Individual results will vary. We're talking about group dynamic, group view, and that's where it gets harder. And so as we look at this, someone can disagree with this violently. And my response to that would be completely. For you, that didn't happen that way. But for a lot of other people, it did happen that way. And what counts here is the majority and how the group performs. Individual results may vary.
Sure.
So if you're thinking, well, that's totally wrong, I'm okay with that. Like I'm not going to be like, it's not a bar fight. We're not going to be getting into it. I'll be like, come on over and I'll buy you a drink. Let's talk about it some more.
Speak for yourself. But we do have to take into account the totality here. And again, this is why we track this for hundreds, thousands of people through these test weeks, is we can't go off a single report. Even a great test taker, someone very knowledgeable, I don't know that I would fully trust them to walk out and set a scale for it. You need the feedback of the collective. That's where this comes from.
There's very few people that I would trust to do that. All of them are LSAT instructors. I'll put it to you that way because they have experience with this. They've seen every test. I would need someone to have seen every single test, taken the LSAT multiple times, and to really know the concepts in and out, to be able to like do questions with me and be like, this is going to cause a lot of problems for people. And for me to be like, yep, you're exactly right. They have to have that level of like second sight on this test. And, even people who are great at the test right now, it's just you don't have quite the perspective. I trust what they say. It's just I wouldn't use one report as completely prejudicial in this situation. And
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
it's really hard to know how this is going to affect the general population just from your own experiences with the test. We see the general population, so we know. I would trust you to go set a curve or
Thank you. I
predict
trust
one.
you as well.
Yeah, I figured that was a given. But
I don't trust you in a lot of things, so I don't know if it should be a given.
curves and bar fights. I'm good at both.
Stay out of my hot tub. You guys wouldn't know this,
There's
but that's
no
an old
context
reference.
needed. It's
Yeah,
fine.
when we lived in Charleston, I went out of town, and John immediately decided to show up with several friends to my house where I had a hot tub and used it until, I don't know, 5 a.m. Let's just say that my neighbors were furious.
I think it actually happened 2 times in a row. You went out of town.
Yeah,
My
it
bad.
did. And I think I screamed at you the second time after my neighbor called up and was like, this is unacceptable. I'm like, what are you talking about, man? I'm in Charlotte. I think I'd just gone to see Muse or something like that. And then I'm like, I'm coming home to this. And I was hungover. I was pissed.
I didn't have a hot tub. What was I supposed to do?
Yeah, right.
You leave me no choice.
You had to come to my house.
Yeah.
And those of you who know Charleston downtown know that everybody lives right on top of each other. So my neighbors were well aware of what you were up to.
Yeah. Especially
Anyway,
the hot
sidebar.
tub.
I think both you and I are like, man. All right, let's get to the LR. So all I will say is at this point, everything has been zero except the following 3 sections: the origami, musical recital, and account and print verify logic games. And then the 2 RCs, the one about jazz, volcanoes, the cycling, and intellectual property, and the other one about rational choice, Mexican murals, water subsidies, and then the birds. All right, each one of those would loosen that scale by 1 from 7 to 8. Now we're going to go through the LR. Here's what I'm going to say in advance. All of the LR except for 1 is going to have no effect on the 170 scaling. So there's only one that is going to loosen it, and that'll be towards the end here. So let's start off. First LR, the fish with the upward-facing eyes, the organization skills and political campaign. Reasonable section. I realize there's always tough questions in this, so when I say reasonable, I mean overall on the LSAT scale. I'm not saying that it was an easy section, because there's always difficulty. It's just that this wasn't out of line with what we expect. That's 0 effect. Same thing with the other section from that particular original test form. That would be the Jupiter-sized moon, the internet search engine results, the squid, also 0. All right, next section. This is the cackling geese, the totalitarian regimes, frowning, also 0 effect on the 170 minus 7 baseline. Then the one that I think is harder to identify, quite honestly, that's the one about the bees and the pollen, had a different Mars question. I think it might have been sympathetic poetry in there, also 0. Then we come to the sections that were primarily from the international test, although used a little bit domestically. Here's the one that changes the scale. This is the one about the carpenter bees and then the lions and the leopards with the crest. That is the one that loosens the scale by 1. And that is primarily, I don't even know if we've been able to figure that out except for having seen this section before and knowing some of the questions on it. That loosens the scale by 1. And then the 6th and final section will have no effect. This is the one with C13, another Van Gogh question about moonrise, and then sleep quality. So essentially what you have there is it is conceivable that you could have tests with -7, but the vast majority of tests on here are going to be -8. And then there are some that could be -9. And there is a sectional order that allows for -10, but I'm not sure that more than a few people had it overall. I think one person that I know might have had it.
Yeah.
And that's the rundown.
Yeah. I was talking to someone earlier, and I didn't want to give it all away, but I said you could also kind of do this by test. For instance, if you knew you had all October 19 sections, like People's Saturday Morning, you're at a -8, frankly. Probably not going to move with the games. Will move, certainly, I think, with the reading comp. There were no LR to move it there. Maybe -8.5, as we talked about. You could do it with, again, the test that was used later into Saturday, that newer form that was harder to pin. It's probably a -8. And then the stuff that we saw internationally, it's probably going to go -8 as well. Possibly could get to -9 depending on if you had other things mixed in. And part of that -8 for the international is coming not from reading comp, but from the games and then an LR. That LR on the international could take it, I think, to a -9.
Yeah, the Carpenter B's LR does on that.
Yeah, the Lion Crest one still stands out to me for multiple instances and just truckload of complaints.
And I just want to kind of summarize this, so people understand. We keep talking about tests. To us, what it looks like is that when LSAC was heading into this weekend, they said, what test forms are we going to use? Well, they always go back into their archive. It appears to us they had 3 different LSATs. And what they said was, all right, here we have this one from October of 2019. Then we have this one I'll just call multiple experimentals. And then they had this other one that was from September 2016 in Europe. These were the 3 full tests, the old 4-section format with 2 LRs. And what they do is they say, all right, we're going to start with this one, then we're going to start mixing in sections from the second one, and then we'll use the third one as well. And then at that point, they just can mix and match them. They didn't do that as freely as they have in the past because they primarily used that September 2016 test for international test takers, but some domestic. But that's why we say, hey, you could figure out it based on these tests. But if you're like, I don't know what you guys are talking about, that's completely insane, then go back and listen to our very long-winded explanation of each section and then just start with 7 and then add either 0 or 1 to it as each case goes through. But notice, nothing in here is -6. There's not that many, -7 outcomes either. And in fact, I'm not sure there are anybody who got a -7. It takes a couple special lineups there, but there's no -6 in here. There's nothing that's like, oh my gosh, this was really easy. And you're not seeing a whole lot that's -10. It is basically a lot of 8s and an occasional 9 that's floating around in there. And I think that seems pretty fair based upon our assessment and all the reports that we have and all the archive information that we have. So I know it took a long time and we got off track a few times because I think you and I are both like, we get to this point and we're almost punch drunk. I'll be honest.
There's a delirium that starts to set in somewhere on Sunday and just doesn't let up. And yeah, it doesn't help that I was sick either, which forced Dave to do double duty on Tuesday.
Yeah, and we're also recording that new course that we're putting together, and so we're trying to fit that in the midst of it. I'm like, I want to go talk about this flaw question, and then I'm trying to be like, wait, is that Van Gogh Moonrise or Van Gogh painting over the canvas? Jeez. So, but that is the rundown, and of course, any mistakes are our fault. Any criticism, certainly we'll accept it. And remember, your individual result can vary here. This is our perception of the entire overall picture of the scale for the 170 score point, and then a little bit down, as I talked about with those 2 LGs. Scores come out on April 29th. It should be around 9 a.m. Eastern time when they send them all out. They all go out pretty quick these days. And that's pretty much all I have, John.
Yeah, that's more than enough, I'd say, from both of us.
Yeah, I'm going to go make another of these azaleas.
I am too.
Might go to sleep. Really tired. So on that, should we close it down?
Let's do it, man. Nice work. I appreciate you carrying me limpingly through the week. You're a good man.
Well, I appreciate that. You certainly held up your end of the bargain with all this. I know how much work this is. I'm not sure anyone else really understands how much work it is, but it is a ton of work to put this together and to track it. I'm glad we've done it over the years, but June should be interesting. I think we'll have a similar experience there. And then in August, we'll really see what happens. I think that's where the challenges can come in, although I'm sure we'll still talk about some of the more notable things that we saw in those tests.
Maybe we can do August from a hot tub. How's that sound?
As long as it's not mine, man. It's your own.
Fine.
And on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions that we might address on a future episode, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, if you took the April LSAT and you are done, congratulations. We hope it went fantastically well. We'll be here for the score release in a couple of weeks. And in the meantime, stay safe and get vaccinated.